Good morning, and good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the May edition of our Human Capital Watch, Digital Transformation, What Does It Take to Lead? And before we get started, just to participate, we would like to make these participatory and like your input as we go along throughout the course of the webcast. So to ask questions as they occur, there's a chat box at the bottom left of your screen. And as those questions come in, it will trigger some conversation with self and our presenters. Feel free to download this presentation. There's a download pod at the bottom center of your screen. You can go full screen for the video and the PTT at any time by clicking the 4 arrows at the top right of the screen. And then most importantly, perhaps, is at the end of the conclusion of the webcast, we'd like you to take a few minutes and complete the evaluation form. It really helps us serve you better for future human capital watches. And of course, you later on, once we're concluded, you can share this podcast with your colleagues, and you're encouraged to do that. It will be available on demand shortly after. So this morning, some of the critical questions and issues that we will be addressing and hopefully answering today is that the fundamental context setter is what is digital transformation and how must an organizational change in a digital era? What does the digital leader need to do to accomplish this transformation? And more importantly, where are companies finding digital leaders, those kind of unicorns or needles in a haystack to lead digital transformation? You can earn credits today, too, for CPE, HRCI, and SHRM credits by staying online for the entire hour, and then as the pop-up boxes come, make your selection as to which course that you're taking and seeking the credits in. So that's really important. Stay with us for the full hour. So today's presenters, I have Mary Young, who's our principal researcher in human capital at the Conference Board, and our digital transformation maven, especially on the human capital and leadership side. Mary, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here because you are also one of our digital transformation researchers. So together we're going to really hit this topic.
Yeah, indeed. And Mary's done some great work looking at the impact of digital transformation on human capital. And myself, I've looked a lot at the impact of digital transformation, digital technologies on the future of work. So hopefully we'll be able to guide this conversation through. And again, reminding you that we really like your input questions as they come up. So the first question we're going to address, and it's the context setter, is what is digital transformation? And the first thing we want to do is poll your audience, our audience out there, to begin. So if we can put up that first polling question to help us set the context for today's webcast.
Oops. Do we not have our polling questions?
Okay, so we're going to close it in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so indeed, the poll results are in. So most of you are somewhat confident in being able to explain digital transformation to somebody else, and not confident 29%. It outweighs those that are highly confident, which is at about 22%. Mary, what do you make of those results?
I think that's absolutely what we see. And you've probably seen that in your research as well. And that's, I think, the value of what we have to offer here this morning is our goal is to move you up that continuum. And you know what? We should ask the same question at the end if we could. If we thought about this, it would have been interesting. That would have been our ultimate evaluation.
Right. I think that this lack of confidence, if we can interpret it that way, the somewhat confident is a real harbinger of part of the problems that organizations face. I mean, if you can't define or explain digital transformation, how do you get everybody on board in an organization? So,
yeah. And so I've got to say that since we began doing digital transformation research and specifically looking at its human capital impacts, one of the things that's been interesting to me is being invited to speak to many of our councils in other areas like risk management or IT or intellectual property or information security or supply chain, and realizing that this kind of vague sense of what digital transformation is really pervades the organization. It's not just in HR, which I think is actually a really exciting thing for HR, and I'll talk more about that. But so this seems to be the right place to start. So when I began doing this research, which is now almost 5 years ago, I will admit that I was pretty low on that continuum. I wasn't completely confident. And so, of course, being a researcher, read everything I could and talked to everybody I could, and came to understand that other people weren't that clear and that there was a very important distinction to be made. So on the left of your slide, you see a list of some of the kinds of emerging digital technology. This list will continue to morph, that are elements of digital transformation, but they are not digital transformation in and of themselves. And that is actually a misperception that many people have, and you can sort of gently correct or educate your colleagues about this, that just adding technology to make an existing process faster or more efficient, to put things online or to put them on, a mobile platform is not digital transformation, but rather digital transformation is what companies do with that technology. The technology itself enables connections between things that never could be connected before. So if you think of a tractor in the field being connected to the cloud, being connected to because it's got sensors on it, and that connects tractors all over India or all over the world for that matter in order to collect data, that's a new kind of connection. Or if you think of individuals who are connected to other individuals inside and outside the organization in ways that never were possible before, collaborating, communicating because of digital technology. That's the second element, the new kinds of connection. The third one is that all of those connections generate masses of data, and that data is the source of insights. The third one, and then finally, all of this gets organized around a strategy. Now, in some companies, they call that a digital strategy because they want to call out that it's a change from the past or the present. And in other companies, they say, no, we only have one strategy, and it is digital. But regardless what you call it, these efforts can't be sort of little separate initiatives. They have to be prioritized and driven from the top. So with that as an understanding, let me show you this model. And for some of you, this may be familiar territory, but we're going to get to what this means for leaders in a bit. So some of the biggest impacts, and I'm going to ask you to be thinking about how this is impacting your own industry or business. Some of the digital transformation's biggest business impacts. First of all, it enables much, when you think of that connectedness, much closer relationships with customers, much greater ability to listen to customers, to hear from customers, maybe to engage customers in innovation, to understand customers' needs very quickly, and to therefore identify little pockets or segments of your customer base. And that in turn allows you to customize things. So just as a Netflix list is supposedly customized to your viewing history, similarly, you can customize more of your products and services to smaller niches of your customer base or potential customers. There's much more collaboration. Again, that technology and connectedness enables people to collaborate within the organization, which I'll talk more about, but also outside the organization. And I'll give you examples of that. And today I'll be talking much more about the way, on the left-hand side, digital transformation causes organizations to have to open up their external boundaries so they're more engaged with their ecosystem. That requires greater transparency because you can't be holding all your cards to your chest the way you did in the past. And that in turn builds democratization, or that is that people inside the organization at all levels have greater access to information, to strategy, to people, regardless of where they are, what level they're in. So there's a democratization in that there's more opportunity, more access for people, regardless of their status. And so anyway, that gives you a picture of the ripple impacts. And then one more thing, just to wrap up here. Digital transformation is some people have said it's equal to the Industrial Revolution and its impact, although it isn't going to be snap and happen in a second. It's going to change for many companies or organizations what business they're in. They may start serving different customers than they ever have in the past, or providing products and services they never knew were needed or had never heard were now emerging in customers' wants and needs. It also, because you're going into new business model, maybe new industries, new customers, it also changes who your competitors are. And that can include startups who are the primo digitally enabled organizations, and who your partners are. I'll be talking lots more about the way organizations, rather than building capabilities inside as their main way of competing, are collaborating much more with organizations on the outside. And I'll talk about some of these other factors on this slide, but this is why digital transformation is so big and why it is really changing the way organizations operate.
Yeah, Mary, I think that's a good point. We know we do our annual CEO survey, global survey called C-Suite Challenge. And one of the things that certainly crops up from the CEO side is, as a major disruptor, is digital technology, but also that notion of serving the customer better and moving from a product-centric approach to what we call servitization. An example would be Diageo has Johnny Walker Smart Bottle that when you purchase it in the store, you take it home, it's linked to your cell phone, you open the bottle at home and it starts giving you cocktail recipes. That extends the relationship. It changes from a one-time purchase to a longer-term relationship. And that's on the minds of CEOs, is moving away from a product-centric culture to one of servitization. And just a second point, I think that does come up from our members that we hear a lot about, or we hear from them, is that often their external digital approach is way better than their internal approach to employees.
Yes, absolutely. We see marketing as being the sort of early adopters of a lot of this. And often internally in HR, the idea is you can learn a lot from marketing because they've been doing this with customers, and we now have to do it with employees. So just to add to your Johnny Walker example, because it stimulates the mind, we can also envision the time when that bottle of Johnny Walker not only gives you cocktail recipes, but it's linked to your liquor store, and they know when you're getting down in the bottle, and they'll just deliver it. So it's something to look forward to, Chuck.
Yeah, indeed. I'm not going to argue about that, that's for sure. Right. So let's go back to a couple more polling questions that we have around the notion of digital transformation and the impact and visions within the organization. So, this question is, so my organization has a vision for a digital future, one that's really kind of widely communicated and embraced by executives and staff alike. So poll is open. Let's see where we land. Yes? Okay, we'll end in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's close the poll. Okay, so less than a third strongly agree that their organization has that strong digital vision. Almost have 43% somewhat agree to it, and then the rest of the polling results are less assured than that. So I think it's interesting that we have only less than a third strongly agree about the vision part.
Well, yeah, I've seen that before, and I think that there's also the case that sometimes companies have a vision, but it's more aspirational, and they know that that's what they want to do, but they haven't figured out how to begin doing it. So
right, and I think when I go back to our C-Suite Challenge survey results, it was less than 15% of CEOs strongly agreed with the notion that they themselves had the digital vision for their organization. So, without that vision, it's pretty hard to start.
Yep, and that's a great setup for the research we're going to talk about today.
Okay, and we have one more polling question we'd like to get to. This is about our leaders, your leaders. Do your leaders currently have the skills and knowledge necessary to make their organization successful in a digital world? All right, we got the numbers coming in. Okay, we're going to close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, poll is closed. Just over 5% strongly agree that that the organization's leaders have that knowledge and skill, and about 60% somewhat agree.
Yeah.
So that's kind of in line too with the CEO numbers. Interestingly enough, it was about 9% of CEOs felt their leadership had those skills and knowledge, but only 5% thought that their employees or the staff had that skills and knowledge. So they had a little more confidence in the leaders, but still not very strong here.
Yeah, and I've seen that in other surveys, the fact that there's a perception that leaders aren't very well prepared for this. That makes perfect sense for me because this is a completely new ball game. And and in terms of employees, that is also the case. So these are all the more reason to be on this webcast. I was going to add one thing, and that's another piece of research, a survey that was done by MIT and I believe it was Harvard Business Review, found that when they asked leaders about functional heads, that is the executive who ran each of the functions in the organization, which ones had the greatest digital acumen, of something like 13 functions, HR was at the bottom of the list. Now that was 2 or 3 years ago, so we're going to hope that there's been some progress there, but that's just something to ponder as well.
Yeah, I think that it's some of it's about attitude. We asked a polling question in that C-suite challenge survey, and we asked what impacts were going to change your position, your job function in the next 20 to 25 years, or the next out to 2025. And interestingly enough, HR group had rated technology as the lowest between CEOs, CFOs, and other functions. The HR group we're not embracing the technology change or the need to come up to speed more with technology. We found that result fairly worrying too.
Yeah, and interestingly, now we're beginning at the conference board a whole series of research reports related to AI and HR. And we're seeing that there are other parts of the organization that are adopting or are using AI, a lower adoption rate so far in HR. So again, these are kind of consistent patterns.
Okay, so what we know is that leadership is a burning platform within most organizations.
It really is. And so what I'd like to do is to quickly review some of the factors, some of the things that organizations are going to need to do differently or be different in digital transformation, because that's the only way to understand what leaders need to be capable of. So this is from some of our previous research. You'll have a list and an ability to link it at the end of the report, of the webcast rather. But let me just briefly summarize some of these things. So from one of our earlier reports on what digital transformation means in terms of organizational structure and culture, here's a model that shows on the right some of the cultural values or ways of behaving that stand in the way of digital transformation. And on the left-hand side, in the blues and greens and purples, are some of the cultural values that enable it. So just briefly, I'll say in terms of barriers, one of the biggest barriers is fear of failure. And I think companies said that was absolutely the number one, that because digital transformation requires sort of continuous experimentation, iterative innovation in a true agile approach to things, that if you have a culture that dings people who make mistakes, who shames them, penalizes them, you are setting up roadblocks to digital transformation. And another value that can really stand in the way is when your organization has a sort of assumption that anything that needs to be done can be best done out inside the organization, and getting help, getting resources, borrowing the capabilities of other organizations is something you're going to be suspect of. You don't think they can do it as well, or think it's just too much of a threat to your IP or your strategic position. So those are real barriers. And the reverse of that is that leaders in digital transformation need to model and need to be strong in things like risk-taking and experimentation and setting up the conditions for that. One of my favorite examples was of a company where they created a new monthly or quarterly award for the company, and it was called the mistake we learned the most from. And they did that partly because they wanted to change people's attitude about mistakes and being penalized for that. In fact, they would reward it if it were something you learned a lot from. Collaboration, you'll hear a lot more, but this is essential to digital transformation. Openness, or let's say receptivity to outsiders, is the reverse of that not invented here mentality. So keep these in mind. Aspects of culture, and of course we know that culture is modeled and led by leaders, and so you can see where this will have an implication for what those leaders of digital transformation need to do. So let me also now just briefly talk about changes in structure before we talk about the leader's role. Two big things here. On the outside, organizations traditionally have kept very secure boundaries. And the logic is that you want to keep inside all the resources and capabilities that you have built because they're the source of your competitive advantage. So you're protecting them from outsiders who might want to sort of take them away or steal them. And you're also protecting those resources and capabilities from trickling out on their own. That's a fundamental way of operating. I think of traditional big corporations, they're like castles that have moats around them. But in digital transformation, that becomes dysfunctional. Remember when I talked about the technology enables all kinds of connectedness that were never possible before, and that includes to others outside. So what this looks like is much more partnering with external organizations. They could be startups, they could be others in your industries or suppliers, but there's much greater partnering because you need to get things done quickly. And there isn't time for organizations to build internal capabilities for all the new things they're going to need to be able to do. So partnerships, it could be investing in an incubator or a startup. It could be bringing, it could be crowdsourcing. It could be doing open innovation. It could be bringing experts from the outside into your organization to do a hackathon because that's a way to accelerate the skill development internally. But lots of ways of opening that boundary. And so think of that when you think of what that means for leaders.
Mary, we've got a question that came in, and I think it relates back to the notion of the vision and maybe even business models, if you will, right? But do you come across organizations that, and I'm paraphrasing here, are looking or doing digital transformation because we can, simply because we can, as opposed to having a proven need for such digital transformation and disruption within the organization?
That's an interesting question. I don't think anybody has ever asked that before, so I love that. I think any organization is not going to just sit around and, they're all set to do digital transformation, but they don't really need to, but they're just going to do it because they can. Because I think it's a struggle and it's a long-term process for any organization. Sometimes people say, hey, well, what about Airbnb? What about Uber? Those are what we would call digital native organizations or digital first. They started that way. And of course, they only started because there was an opportunity. But I've never seen an organization that just sort of was ready to go with digital transformation. Every single interview we've done with companies, every single case study we've written, it's been about a process that requires significant change and learning as an organization and pivoting. So I think that's, and then the second part of that question really relates to what if you don't need to? And I would take a hard look at that because I don't know, I can't think of many organizations that aren't going to be, if not threatened, then needing to change in response to changes in their customers, changing in their competitors, changes in their industry. All these things can affect your need as an organization to also undergo digital transformation.
Right. I mean, I think it's the customer-driven part that the preferences are really important here to understand that, and the expectations of those customers when dealing with organizations. I think in the B2C space, it's probably more critical at this point in time than it is in the B2B. But even that relationship of supplier is changing. I mean, you're looking as not a purchase, but as a partner and a solutions provider. So I think it would be hard to find an argument to say, well, we're doing this just because we can, as opposed to we need to from a business case.
Right, and we hear a lot from B2C companies. Let's say you're in the business of, I'm making this up, but shoe repair. And companies say, our competitor is no longer Joe's shoe repair down the street, it's Amazon. Not that Amazon is, so far anyway, as far as I know, doing shoe repair online, but they have changed customers' expectations so much that that's who you have to respond to. Amazon's raised the bar, and so therefore, in a way, it's your competitor in terms of service delivery.
And let's take another question. So this comes in and says, are you seeing organizations starting to blur those boundaries when looking at developing digital skills? So are they looking to partner with outside partners to develop those skills for internals?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So here are some of the ways we've seen it. We've seen it in terms of partnering with incubators, bringing startups into your organization to work alongside your employees or to share how it is you go about, let's say, with your agile methods. We've seen it in terms of companies using crowdsourced innovation, putting things on an open innovation platform and allowing talent on the outside. We're seeing it in terms of organizations increasing their external networks, so you get to interact with people who aren't your employees but who are experts in the field. I mentioned the idea of bringing the hackathon, where you might bring outside experts in to work alongside your employees because you're doing a kind of skills transfer. You could think of it, we've seen companies that are hiring digital talent not just to make up for their own deficits of those skills, but also to pass them along to others within the organization. So there are lots and lots of ways of doing this. And so that's a very common thing.
Yeah, I think one of the important things, and I know we have examples of organizations that have come to the conclusion that in this kind of tight labor market, it's pretty hard to hire your way out of a digital talent shortage, especially when you think of those specific skills get outdated in 18 to 24 months that you're hiring for. So it's really more about the evolution of your existing talent than it is perhaps about going outside and in these tight labor markets, hiring those skills that run the risk of being outdated fairly quickly.
I would say it's about developing skills internally, but also accessing them outside in ways other than hiring people as employees. So it's much more, it's much more fluid relationships that might be just for a project. Or might be just for a weekend with an intensive. Here's one more example. A pharma company we know, one of our members, said that they were building a new facility, and included in the building were a certain number of sort of innovation labs that were not for the company itself, but rather from outside companies whom it would invite to come in and use the space. And the assumption was that having them on site would be a kind of accelerator for thinking. It would be a way of stimulating their own R&D team or engineering team. So that was another way of opening their boundaries to the outside.
We have one more question. I think that it's great that we're having the participation of our audience here, but I think this is an interesting question, is that, so what seems to be the bigger problem in your experience? Organizations that are resistant to digital transformation with regards to partnering externally, those external boundaries, or resistance internally to digital transformation? Which seems to be the bigger problem?
That's a great question. So this is my opinion, but I think that it is so fundamentally threatening to many business leaders. Digital transformation is. They know it's important, but it's not part of their toolkit. It isn't how they rose to the positions they occupy now. It's not their area of expertise. They've gotten to be senior executives by knowing the answers, and they don't know the answers about digital transformation. And I'll talk more about this later on when I'm talking about leadership for digital transformation. So I think that's almost the first hurdle, or one of the first hurdles. And I think that within the workforce, of course, there's tremendous fear about what this means about my job security, or about whether my skills are going to have any value, et cetera. And I do think that that's threatening. I also think organizations can do a lot to prepare people for this, to give them the tools to navigate their careers and know what it is they need to develop, and to see where the business is heading. And they can also, that means providing technology that helps employees do that, and skills. And I think through careful messaging, that I'm not talking about sugarcoating things, but to your point that organizations can't, it isn't even an option to just hire all new people, right, or mostly new people. So I think it's about, transparency is a big issue here. So being transparent about where you're headed, what's going to be most important, what are the resources that can help you as an individual get there.
Right, and I think it comes back to that vision, and a clearly articulated vision as to why the transformation is necessary, and yes, then being, as you say, transparent on the impact. And I think one of the big messages that HR can send through an organization is to explain that it's not about the elimination of jobs, it's about the evolution of jobs. And I think that's an important message to get across.
And every organization I've talked to says that there are some people in your workforce and there are some people in your executive office who are not going to be able to make the transformation. So, there's that notion of, do you have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset? Are you somebody who's curious, inquisitive, and wants to learn new things? Are you somebody who's going to dig in their heels, and that latter person isn't going to make it? Right. So let me finish up on what we saw changing in terms of structure, so we can get on to talk about leadership. So the other way we saw that organizations are changing a lot in their structure is that in the old days, just as there was a very clearly defined external boundary, there were also, the structure was quite fixed. So you had a hierarchy, you had verticals or silos of functions or business units. You had very clearly defined job descriptions and job titles, and a whole, job rating with bands, et cetera. These things took a long time to evolve, and they were, or to create, and they were sort of like the skeleton of the organization, not pliable or bendable. But digital transformation changes that. It requires faster responses and more fluid kind of, let's bring the stakeholders together to deal with this problem. Let's do more cross-functional collaboration. I've talked about, so that what you see on the right is an image of these teams that may coalesce around one project, may break apart, and people will go to another project. In order to do this, individuals, regardless of the level they are in the organization or how long they've been there or their formal job title, need access to more information. That requires greater transparency. So organizations that used to control who knew what, who had access to whom and when, that stands in the way. That's another barrier to digital transformation. So now organizations have to allow and give people the tools to enable them to take on projects that might not be within their formal, job description, if that's what's needed, and to look for experts using an internal, let's say, search platform that allows you to find answers to questions somewhere in the organization, people you would never meet otherwise, or to find collaborators. So much more fluid structure and much more knowledge sharing. Collaboration is, one of the highest values, and it takes place across what were previously the very kind of rigid structures. So that's a quick version of how organizations have to change. And I'm going to really recommend that you read an earlier report if this interests you, to learn more and read case studies about how structure changes externally and external boundary, and internally, how culture changes. But now I want to get to the heart of this webcast, which is, what does this mean for leaders? Do we need to stop for any questions, or shall we move on?
We can move on right now. I'm sure we'll have more.
Okay, great. So first of all, I just want to say our research, when we talk about the digital leader, this could be a team or it could be an individual. But the definition is it's the person who is responsible, or persons who are responsible for leading the company's digital transformation, probably for developing a strategy for that and for overseeing, the processes and the decisions and the strategy for achieving it. And this research, which was released several months ago, looks at what these leaders do, how they got into those roles, where they came from, what they need to be able to do in those roles. So that's what I want to share with you now. So my field is, I have a doctorate in organizational behavior and a master's in organizational development. And I mention that only because this is sort of how I think of organizational change. And I think we can all appreciate the fact when you work in a great, big, huge organization, it is a monstrous task to succeed in changing that organization. And digital transformation is about as massive a change as anybody's ever going to have to lead. And my metaphor for this is, if you were, think of an organization, a big organization is like a great, big, heavy box. And if you were trying to move that box across the room, and you were simply trying to do that by pushing, there is a great expenditure of energy. You're trying to overcome a lot of resistance, and it's a heavy slog. Another way to do this, however, is to tilt that cube up on its corner and then pivot it, and then put it down on another corner and pivot it again. And that, in a way, is my metaphor for what the digital transformation leader does. That person or team becomes this sort of pivot point that enables the huge organization, the heavy box, to ultimately move to this further, the further point, but to do it with less effort by enabling it. So that's what I want to talk about. How do people do that? There are well-known, completely valid models for the roles of a leader. And what I want to talk about are the things that are above and beyond those usual roles. Don't replace them, but are in addition that digital transformation requires. And the first of these, Chuck, is what we asked people about in one of our polling questions, which was setting the vision. And honestly, if people don't understand digital transformation, how can they envision what this organization is going to look like, or what would be different about it? Now, to a certain extent, that's unknown, because this will emerge over time. But the digital leader needs to be able to provide a compelling and clear vision of what we do know about how the organization will operate differently, and why that's necessary. So that is one of the chief digital officers we interviewed for this research said he basically felt he spent the first year on that alone. And one of the measures of success is he felt by the end of the first year, the executive team all got it. And that's not where they were at the beginning. So that's the first thing, setting the vision and having a strategy for how you communicate that throughout the organization. It won't happen quickly. You're going to have to keep, it's a long educational process. The second thing that the digital leader does is to act like a kind of explorer or scout. And if you think of that person if you're in the US listening to us, this metaphor will make sense. But when you think of those scouting parties that set out from the East or the Midwest, going to the far West, however big the exploration party was scouting, there were always one or two scouts who went out up front and who went ahead of the rest of the party and would bring back reports of what the landscape looked like, and what kind of people they met, were they friendly, were they enemies, etc. And so in a lot of ways, the digital leader is the person who does that for the organization. And that means that digital leader has to be really in touch with what's changing. They need to understand, what kinds of new technologies could impact the organization. How are organizations in other industries leveraging that technology or these new capabilities? What are competitors doing? What kinds of startups are out there who might make good partners, etc. So you're the person who's, if you think of that carefully bounded organization, you're the person who's forever crossing those boundaries and going outside to bring back intelligence like a scout. Because you know that that's not a strength probably for most of your current executives. That's the boundary spanning on the outside. There's also boundary spanning in the inside. That digital leader needs to cross functions, needs to cross business units to connect sort of the promising digital leaders in one area with those in another, to share best practices, or this is what they're doing, to suggest you might want to partner with this other unit, etc. So that's another part of the job.
Yeah, if I can just there's one notion that we're hearing a lot about, and this notion of paradigm shifts within organizations vis-a-vis digital transformation and kind of personal responsibility. And not that it contradicts with the notion of a digital scout, but one of the notions that comes up is that it used to be IT's responsibility to find what the latest technology is and then sort of bring it in-house. And now that paradigm has shifted, where any business unit, any functional leader needs to have that awareness of what technology is out there to help maximize performance. So it used to be IT's role, now it's kind of everybody's role.
Yeah, it is. And when on this point, I bet some of our viewers or audience members do the same thing, but I don't subscribe to Harvard Business Review. I get that, the articles online, and there are other business and management journals that I get from our resources here at the Conference Board, but I have my own subscription to Wired and to Fast Company. And for me, that's the way to keep track of what's happening out there. And it isn't just new technology, but it's social impacts. How's it changing government? Or how's it changing, something in a developing country? What's it enabling? And I feel like this is sort of part of my scanning. And I think that, we all have to find our ways to do that.
Right. No, I think it's a good point. And there was another notion that I particularly am fond of, and I think it's applied to our organization here internally, the Conference Board, is that, for years we talked about getting IT to speak the language of business, and now business needs to speak the language of IT. I think that's totally flipped on its head in its digital era.
I'm going to talk in a moment about also why you wouldn't want to depend on IT exclusively, that their view may be useful in their function, but may not be broad enough. I talked about connector, the change agent role, but the digital role model is extremely important, because your executive team are having to learn new ways of leading. Ways that allow more transparency, where you're sharing more information, you're having more give and take with people at all levels to explain the rationale for things, to acknowledge mistakes when they don't work out. We know that younger workers want this kind of transparency, but because digital transformation makes it impossible for leaders to keep everything under wraps, they have to be more transparent. So and you also need to be able to allow project teams who are solving problems to have access to the information they need and to make more decisions independently. So these are some of the ways in which the role of the leader is really different. And the digital leader should be the exemplar of this. Now, just as one example, we know that digital technology enables lots of new ways for leaders to listen to employees and also to communicate with them. So if you take an internal social platform like a Yammer or a Slack, you can have ongoing dialogue with employees about new policies or getting their feedback on something or hearing what they're observing in the field. You can also listen. I don't mean spy on people, but I mean you have a way to ask polls every single week to take the pulse of the workforce. You could also have your analytics people analyze text in open-ended questions in those polls to do sentiment analysis and figure out how are people feeling, where have you got pockets of resistance. These are capabilities that a digital leader probably needs to demonstrate and for the rest of the organization. So
this sort of teaching, educator role, becoming the kind of paragon of digital leadership, is also a really, really important part of the role.
Yeah, I think the connector role is essential. But when we're talking about internal networks and mapping internal networks, the issue that always comes up is this changing notion of data confidentiality. Is that an issue that
No, it's funny because I was just speaking to one of the world's big technology companies, whom I can't name, that's why I'm describing them, last week, and they were, they wanted to, they could be spying on everybody every single second, and they said it is so important in terms of employee trust and engagement to have extremely clear guidelines about how they do and do not use data, and to live up to those guidelines. They couldn't, it would be disastrous for them from a strategic perspective to lose that trust. So, but what they are is completely transparent about what their standards are, what they will do and what they won't. So I think when you're talking about using digital communications to get a sense of the workforce, to get a sense of when you've got merging trouble spots or pockets of dissent, you're not looking at individuals, but rather, wow, the satisfaction over here is great, but we're there's a significant amount of pushback coming from over here, but we're not looking at individuals. Yeah, but that's a perfectly reasonable concern. So you got to be very proactive about explaining to people, because the employee trust is, it's like the rug you stand on. You pull that rug out, and you're going to fall on your face as a company, and you're not going to be able to use data. So really important. So I want to get to the juicy part now. We saw in our research many different models of digital leadership, and each of these had some pros and some cons. The ultimate, companies told us, the thing you'd most like to do would be to have your CEO be the leader of digital transformation. And in the future, I think, yes, that will be the way it is. But in many organizations, digital transformation is new enough and a radical enough departure from business as usual that CEOs aren't ready to be the chief digital officer or the leader of digital transformation, and would be among the first to say so. So a desirable outcome, but in many cases not where the organization is today. Okay, so who can do it? In some companies, the thought is, let's get the CIO or the chief technical officer. And they probably have lots of experience leading enterprise-wide transformation, and they certainly are familiar with internal systems, and they've served the needs of many different functions, but they may not understand the business as well as they need to, because that hasn't been, who your competitors are in the business environment, that hasn't been really their focus, so that could be a potential drawback. Marketing, chief marketing officer is sometimes a candidate because marketing tends to be in the lead with anything that comes with data and analytics and using technology, in this case, to build strong relationships with customers and to listen to customers and to use data to understand customers. So that could be a lead. However, they too may not understand the broad business, and they may not have a great understanding of other functions, and so there are potential drawbacks there. An increasingly common solution is to name someone with the title of Chief Digital Officer. And there's statistics on this that show there's a growing number of companies that are doing this. In 2015, according to one study, just 6% of companies had a Chief Digital Officer or CDO, and by 2018 it had gone up to 20%. So there's a trend here. That may be a powerful way to signal to your organization that things are changing. We're creating a new C-level role. You may find that person inside your organization, or you may look outside. But that's a solution that some companies choose. And the potential downside of that is the person as an outsider could be rejected. The person could be viewed very likely as a threat by the rest of your C-suite. Because digital transformation may mean that some parts of the business are going to go away. I mean, some lines of business that have been tremendously important and successful may be less viable in the future. So that's a potential downside also. I think in terms of, while it's great for the CEO to be the ultimate digital leader, I think it's also the case that we're going to see more and more companies who, as the entire C-suite becomes more comfortable with digital transformation, we'll see teams who are overseeing digital strategy or a digitized business strategy, because that expertise and knowledge and way of leading will become, more widely dispersed in the organization, and it won't have to be a special person. So in terms of conclusions from this research, and then we'll have time for more questions, is we heard a lot of strong views about who should lead digital transformation. It won't surprise you to know that when we talk to chief technology or chief information officers, they all just passionately believed that they are the ones who should lead digital transformation. When we talked to chief digital officers, they often saw that there were limitations with marketing or IT or CTOs leading digital transformation, and that there were great advantages to having a CDO, where the IT and tech people would say, we don't need a digital transformation leader, a CDO. So I think it depends on where you sit. I don't think there's any one best solution here, although I do think we're going to be moving ultimately to teams. Maybe the most provocative thing we found in our research, it was really shocking how many companies told us that within the first year of digital transformation, there had been so much churn at the top of the organization. Now, one of the CEO, Francisco Gonzalez, who is head of BBVA, which is a global financial services firm, very big and very leading in digital banking, headquartered in Spain, said this to him was the blind spot. This is the thing he didn't see coming. He said, within the first year, I had to reconstitute my leadership team, my executive leadership team, 3 times until I got it right. We heard this from a number of companies. One big technology company said 60% of their executive team changed in the first 2 years of digital transformation. We heard other figures like that from other companies. So I say that, not in a threatening way, but it certainly appears that just as employees' growth mindset, their willingness to learn and to stretch and to be inquisitive enough to keep learning is as important a competency at the executive level as it is throughout the organization.
Yeah, that sends when you have that churn at the top at that level, it must send shivers through the spine of the organization to some extent. If it can affect the top, it's going to rattle the bottom too. A tough challenge for HR to handle, right?
Yeah, but you know what? This is I think the really good news, and this is something that excites me. As long as I've been doing research on HR-related issues in organizations of whatever sort, you always hear HR has to develop business acumen. And so it's this notion of HR has to play catch-up. It has to learn what business leaders learn in order to play. But it's sort of coming from the back of the pack. And with digital transformation, that's not the case. Everybody is starting from zero on this. And so for once, HR doesn't have to play catch up. You can be right there in sync with everybody else who's learning. One of the case studies we did was with Assurant, which is a large, if you think of like your owner, the policies you get on your cell phone against breakage for repair or whatever, you get it on another electrical device. Assurant offers those kinds of products often to the cell phone company. But Assurant created a team, partnered with external executives who had experience in digital transformation to develop and execute a digital strategy for the company. And HR was on that team. HR was right there, learning from day one alongside the CEO and other executives. And I think that even if you're not a CHRO, you have the opportunity to become part of this. And that's a huge opportunity for HR. And the whole time you can be thinking of, what does this mean for us in terms of HR? Companies we interviewed, chief digital officers and HR leaders, said HR needs to be able to think of the HR challenges before digital leaders get around to thinking about it, because they won't be thinking about it. You need to be able to challenge their assumptions because they won't have any experience in this area. And so it's a huge opportunity, but you can't be shy about this.
No, I think it's an exciting time to be in HR in the digital era.
Absolutely. You got to get that subscription to Wired and Fast Company, though. And then I think that this is a moving platform. Today's configuration at the top is going to be different 5 years from now. I spoke at the beginning about the fact that some companies just say we have a business strategy and it's increasingly digital. Others say, we have a digital business strategy. But I think the latter option is going to fade away because digital is just going to permeate everything organizations do. And similarly, the leadership of digital transformation will become the job of every leader. So I think we'll see that over time.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. I mean, I always draw back an analogy to the notion of, say, the quality function, which at one time sat separately as its own and was overlaid across the organization. And today that notion of quality is built into every business process.
But it was its own big thing.
Right. No, absolutely.
Yeah, so those are the big picture conclusions. And I hope we've stimulated your interest in reading more. On this slide, you can see a list of all of our digital transformation and human capital publications, including Chuck's C-Suite Challenge, as well as his on the future of work, and some others that I and others have worked on. And this slide, which you can download the slide, actually these are hot links to the report, so that makes it a lot easier for you. And Chuck, you want to talk about our next one?
Yeah, so our next Human Capital Watch webcast is going to center around talent mobility. I think it's an excellent report, and it looks at the strategic importance of talent mobility, and especially in a digital era, as this notion of project teams becomes the work nexus in organizations. How do you staff them? How do you make sure that talent and development and that you're meeting those demands for development opportunities? And it's all about talent mobility. And Robin Erickson and Marion Devine, I think, have done an excellent piece of work looking at not only the strategic importance of talent mobility, but the ways to go about it. And there's some really interesting practices and case studies in this report, something that we hope you'll tune in on June 19th for. And coming in October, we have the Future Ready Organization. This is a conference built around our C-Suite Challenge report and survey, which was focused on what a future organization or the organization in 2025 needs to do to be successful. Everything from the notion of business models and digital transformation to talent issues. Talent certainly became is the number one issue on minds of CEOs. So this event will look at a broad range of strategies, obstacles, and ways to overcome them to build a future-ready organization.
And Chuck, wait, you got to go back one. I just want to mention, as a bargain hunter, don't miss out on the fact that you can get a $500 discount by using the code here. So that's pretty cool.
Right. It sounds like we're on the Home Shopping Network. I love it.
I know.
Here we go. And finally, as we wrap up today, your feedback and suggestions are really important for us. They really do help us shape our issues, shape our research, shape our topics, and help to better serve you. So please tell your colleagues about the next month's webcast, and also that this webcast will be available on demand shortly thereafter. And please, you contacting us to help us set our research direction is great. And remember to sign up for email reminders for the Human Capital Watch webcast series. And finally, please do take some time at the end of this webcast to fill in your response and feedback. Is really important for us. So from here in New York, I want to thank Mary Young for a great conversation, and that wraps us up for today. And we hope to see you on June 19th for Talent Mobility. Thanks, and see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.